All right. So today I wanted to use this, I wanted to begin this lecture by discussing a really important issue in my house. So my kid is obsessed with their Google Home. We have like multiple Google Homes. We have my partner has Siri. So we realize how much we discuss and we have conversations with the artificial intelligence in our homes. The other night, I heard my kid yelling at their Google Home for some reason for getting the answer wrong, and so it made me start to think about this idea of intelligence and how we define it in our society. I know that with artificial intelligence, my partner used to work at Google, and now we have these self-learning computers that are proliferating through the tech field currently. And so what we consider intelligence is completely shifting, and specifically in regards to artificial intelligence. So when I say this word intelligence, what does that mean for you? Like, what does intelligence mean? It's a weird question, but Andrea.
Are you asking for the definition of intelligence regarding the artificial aspect or
Just
intelligence overall?
Something intelligent.
That's a good question. I don't know. I guess it would have to be something related in terms of able to understand or acknowledge a certain amount of information and knowing what to do with that.
So understanding information and doing something with that information.
Or being able to process information. I think that's how I would call intelligence. Like it could be anything so basic as like, I don't know, water hitting on me. And then if I was not intelligent and didn't know what to do with water just raining on top of me, then I would not call myself intelligent. But like, I don't know. I guess it depends on the circumstances.
All right. Ashley says the ability to understand, to know, and process information. So if you're able to process and know information, you are intelligent. Is that correct?
I feel like you have some form of intelligence if you're able to do that, because not everything could be, you have some form of intelligence. You're not maybe super intelligent, but you have some form of intelligence. Yes.
Okay.
If I could put a little bit in here.
Yeah, go for it.
Isn't that really just consciousness? It's a difference between performing an action and then knowing why you're performing an action. I think has to do with consciousness more over than intelligence, because at a base level, all things are intelligent. If you participate in any biological function, you have the intelligence to do so and to survive. But what separates us from animals maybe is the intelligence that we have surrounding that we are conscious and that we can make inferences and use inductive reasoning and all kinds of stuff. So I wonder if making something intelligent is a measure of how conscious you are of a situation, or is it what it looks like on paper? I don't know. It's hard.
All right. I actually love where we're going. We're going to stop right there. Yeah, Stephen. Sorry.
So I guess I wanted to address what was just said is a lot of what modern artificial intelligence like Google and Amazon, with Alexa and Google Assistant are using is actually machine learning. And so I would say they are capable of taking information in some capacity and then, doing something with it, but they don't seem to actually have a proper understanding of like the world around them, which I think would be the point where consciousness comes into play. Like they are to some extent intelligent, but they're not particularly conscious because the only way they're able to process that information is specifically how they have already been essentially programmed to process it. They can't, you can't just hook up Google Assistant to a camera and a couple motors and it'll start driving around your house and doing things for you. Someone explicitly has to teach it to do that. But once it has been taught, it is capable of then processing that information. So it is, I guess, to some extent intelligent, but not conscious.
All right. So that brings us to this really interesting case. Many of you have probably seen this in the last couple of years, but the good folks over at Boston Dynamics have created robots that are able to manipulate the environment around them. So this is the Parkour Atlas. So that machine is able to do box jumps. It's able to understand the environment around itself, and it's able to then use that information to alter its body in order to jump. This is another robot from a couple of years ago, developed by Boston Dynamics. Sorry. So these robots, they are able to manipulate the environment around it. In this case, you saw one robot move out of the way, allow another robot to take over. That robot was able to manipulate the door, open it, wait for its partner to exit, and then was able to follow it. Is that an instance of intelligence? Is this an instance of consciousness? Stephen.
I would say that it is intelligence because it is, and there are further videos of these where people actually smacking them around as they're trying to do this stuff, and they adapt to that. So they are taking in information about the environment and to some extent processing and understanding it and using that to then achieve a goal. So it's like that is some level of intelligence, but I still don't think it's quite any level of consciousness, because if you say they have been very explicitly taught how to deal with a lot of these things in the environment. You know, this happens, you do this, there's this in the way, this is how you get around that. And so if you were to say waterproof one of these robots and throw them in a lake, there's no way in hell it's going to learn how to swim or even attempt to swim. Like a conscious being to some extent would try to swim. I'm pretty sure that the robots would just sink. And so they don't really have the capability of learning without explicitly being taught. They are more processing the information that they have been given in a manner in which they have already been taught how to process it in order to achieve a very specific goal.
So does something need to have a fight or flight reaction in order for it to be conscious?
I guess that's not necessarily the point I was trying to hit there. Is not so much the fight or flight, but more the ability to
Adapt.
learn without someone having to explicitly teach it how to learn something. So it's like humans to some extent are able to learn, and of course we have people who teach us, but the I guess the machine learning algorithms that a lot of these artificial intelligence systems use have to be very explicitly given sets of information in a very specific way in order to learn. It's often very difficult to just like, you know, you build the robot, you put it on the ground, it's not going to really learn to walk. You have to explicitly go in and program it to do so.
All right, we're going to come back to a couple of your statements in a second, Jordan. That was really great. You brought up some really great points. We're going to come back to that in a second. Madeline.
I just wanted to further, I think that what the robots lack is adaptability, and a whole talk about consciousness versus intelligence, the fight or flight thing. I don't think it's necessarily that they cannot be taught that process, but it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's inference is a thing. It's you have to know, okay, I'm like Jordan was saying, I'm in this body of water, I have to swim, or I'm in this area where there are rocks on the ground and I have to pay attention in case I trip and fall. And I have to know how to get back up, and I have to know why I'm getting back up, and I have to know if I fall, I'm going to hurt myself. And I think that if we try to replicate human understanding, because in a sense, when we're talking about intelligence, that's all we really know, in a robot or in a being that we've programmed, it would be like raising a child. And our artificial intelligence, I think, has to start from a point of birth to adulthood in order to truly understand what kind of intelligence you can amass from day-to-day life. If you're going to compare constructive learning to a point that they would then be a conscious learner or just a programmed learner, that's kind of where the divide happens.
Great point. Let's actually play around with this for a second. So there's this really famous experiment developed by John Searle, who was one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence in the 1970s, 1980s. And he developed this experiment. It's called the Chinese experiment, or the symbol room experiment, because we started to realize that that was racist to call an experiment Chinese. So for this particular experiment, it plays around with some of what you guys are talking about, Madeline and Jordan, of adaptability. So suppose you're in a room which has two slots. From slot number one, someone gives you Chinese characters, which you don't recognize as words. You don't know what these small characters mean. In the room with you is a rule book in English in which you can use to construct Chinese characters from those that were given to you. You proceed to match the Chinese symbols received to the same type of Chinese symbols to which are attached to a set of English directions. You then deposit those directions back in Chinese into slot number two. Do you now understand Chinese? Someone gave you a slip of paper that has Chinese. You had an English to Chinese rule book. You were able to decipher it and then put it back into its slot. Do you now understand Chinese? No. And the reason why, this is kind of classic artificial intelligence. So that when we think of artificial intelligence programming, this is the traditional way in which we kind of view that. Now, the next part of this, though, is really interesting. So suppose that that rule book is such that people outside this room can discuss with you in Chinese. For example, they send you a question in slot number one asking, how are you? And following the rule book, you would give a meaningful answer. I am feeling splendid. How are you? Do you now understand Chinese? Ashley?
No, you just know how to answer one question.
Yeah, and so, but if they were to ask you a series of questions and you were to use that rule book, would you then understand Chinese, Stephen?
I would say you don't understand it because you have to use the rule book in order to both understand the information coming in and to then put that in the information that you have that you wish to return back into the form in which it can be understood by the outside world. So you don't understand it, but if you were to get to the point, you did this long enough that you no longer needed the rule book, then you would understand Chinese if you no longer needed the rule book. But
Do you
that
need spell
needing of the
check?
rule book.
Do you need spell check? Do you sometimes look up words that you haven't heard before?
I do, and I would say that in that specific case, there's a small part, a small part of English that I don't understand in that specific word, or maybe but I would say as a whole, I understand English conceptually. There may be just small parts, small specific instances of it that I don't understand. And so with the case of Chinese, you're having to use that rule book to construct the entire answer because you don't understand, any of the language, presumably. Whereas if you are able to get to the point where you don't have to reference the rulebook constantly, then you're beginning to understand Chinese. That's how I would frame it.
Okay, Andrea, Madeline, and then Ashley. You're on mute.
For the second one, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So for the second one, when the rule book is given to people, then yes, you do understand Chinese because you understand the essence of what is being asked. Whereas in the first one, you understand how to translate.
Okay, Madeline.
So it's really funny how this class and my philosophy class link up. I mean, all the time, it's constant. And there's this idea of functionalism and Cartesian dualism, meaning that does your mind and body exist together or separately, and what makes up the process of being? And Searle's argument, if strong AI were true, then a cognitive capacity can be acquired by implementing the computer program stimulating the cognitive capacity. So if you are given a program that lets you know Chinese, that allows you to decipher symbols, for example, in the Chinese language, then in a sense, you could suppose that you understand Chinese, but like Jordan said, we as a species, or not species, what am I saying? We as Americans have a fundamental understanding of English because it's the language that we grew up with. And we may forget how to spell a word, or we may forget a phrase, but at the same time, it's still something. We look at the word the, and if it's spelled with two E's, we know it's wrong. But if you were given a Chinese symbol and it was wrong, but you were the only thing that it was what you knew to be true, you wouldn't know in that moment if it was wrong or right. You would just be trusting this rule book that was given to you. And so in a sense, you would not know Chinese.
All right, Ashley, and then we'll move on.
So yeah, I was just gonna piggyback kind of with Jordan. From when you asked the question of, do you have to use spell check or things like that? Like, I feel like we do use that, but I think it's only because we've moved to a whole different era than always just writing out things. We use text talk and all that kind of stuff. So we speak this fluently, we use it a lot, but because we have gotten so used to slang or texting, and we do these short versions of things, that's where the spell check and all those kind of things kind of help us kind of reacclimate to the traditional quote unquote English language and getting things right when we have to be professional. But other than that, no, we are very fluent in like our English, but to say we know Chinese just based on using that rule book, I don't think would be accurate to say.
All right, thank you. And so you guys are all right. The second part, it's more traditionally into what is now artificial intelligence, where we program these algorithms within these machines, and they're able to utilize these algorithms to learn and are able to adapt, but they are privy to the algorithms that we have set up. So they have to operate within those certain functions. And so the reason I wanted to talk about this idea of intelligence is because I think it's one of those terms that we throw around a lot, but we don't actually define. And when we start to really dig into the definition of it, we start to realize it's more complex than we've ever given it credit for. And so that brings us to my last kind of example before we delve into our concepts today. It's based upon this really famous Parisian film of the late 1950s, early 1960s. It was called The Lovers. It was a film by Louis Maillet, produced in 1958. It's a story of a young woman who's married to an older man, and it's a loveless marriage. So she visits her friends in Paris every weekend. Her best friend is having this romantic affair with this guy that she doesn't really like. It's a sexual affair. And eventually the married woman picks up an affair with that man herself. And the husband one day says, hey, you guys really enjoy hanging out together. Why don't you guys come over to my estate and bring your friends? And so she brings her best friend and her new lover to the house. They have an awkward dinner. Her and the lover make passionate love to the side. It's a 1958 film, so there's like close-up photography of like her face in pleasure, which was something that was not seen for him before. Additionally, her and her new lover get on the outs in addition to her and her husband, and she falls in love with an army sergeant on the side. So she is living her best damn life in 1958. So this film has a lot of sexual energy to it. It's not overt. It's very like 1960s kind of sexuality. And so in 1964, a theater owner in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, decided to show this film. And this film leads to one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in American history that comes up, that you might have heard the phrase, I know it when I see it. And this is the main case that this comes from. And so Jacobellis was the theater owner. He shows this film and he was fined $750 for obscene material. So they said that he was showing pornography to the general public. And so in this particular case, it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court involving whether it was consistent with the First Amendment. So Jacobellis was arguing that it was his First Amendment right to show this film. And so the state of Ohio deemed this film obscene, and it was actually a $2,500 fine in which he was convicted for. And so the Supreme Court actually reversed the conviction of this case, ruling that the film was not obscene and so was constitutionally protected. But it leads to this really famous response by Justice Potter Stewart, in which he says the Constitution is protects all obscenity except for hardcore pornography. And when it comes to the question of hardcore pornography, I shall not today attempt further to define the kinds of materials I understand to be embraced within that shorthand description, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it. And the motion picture involved in this case is not that. And so for the last 40 to 50 to 60 years, our interpretation of hardcore pornography isn't actually a definition. It's community standards. It's I know it when I see it. Is that a good enough definition to describe hardcore pornography? And if so, what's wrong with that? Madeline.
I think especially in law, objectivity is dangerous. I think that if you're going to attempt to define what is right or lawful for a population, it should, take into account the subjectivity of what you are either attempting to censor or get rid of, whatever. But definitively speaking, this is like kind of an uncomfortable subject, but if you were to look at any of the movies from the modern era, there's not a whole lot of straight up sex in them. It's a lot of, the close-up shots of lovers have with passionate faces or moaning over, very intense music. It's not, what you would see on like Pornhub or whatever. So I think if, in order to amend this, you could say any sort of adult movie that is explicitly there to show people acts of sexual encounters or passionate encounters and not have any sort of story, that would be something. Whoa, that would be something.
What a stupid ass shit from off of here.
That'd be something more along the lines.
Draw something. Draw him at the fucking ramp.
All right, continue.
I lost my train of thought. That's really it.
Andrea, then Steven.
Just to clarify, because I think I either misheard it or I just was thinking way into it. This film only showed the face.
Yeah, face and like it was, like bare arms caressing.
But no, like I say body parts that are usually deemed as sexual were shown.
No lower body parts. There might have been like the top of a breast.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that's hardcore porn in my opinion.
And so, but is it okay that we don't have a definition for hardcore pornography?
No, it's not okay that we don't have one. We should have one.
Okay,
We definitely need to have we definitely need to have a definition for hardcore porn.
Yeah. Let's go to Steven.
So I think a point that was brought up was that being objective can be bad, but I think that being overly subjective can be bad as well. And I think, I'm not personally entirely happy with I know it when I see it, because now it leaves the definition up to this one specific justice. What happens when they pass away? What happens if they see something that they personally do not like and then decide to call it, that something that may be not actually hardcore pornography, but they decide to call it that because they know it when they see it. You don't have an objective definition of it. Now, I guess if you were trying to make something that would not be counted as obscene, where's the line drawn? The line is drawn and a justice says, I know it when I see it. Well, do you get to call them up and be like, can you come watch this and tell me if it is or
Well, it's
isn't? Like,
community standards. So the community gets to dictate what is hardcore pornography. And so if it was a sex scene between two men in the 1970s in a film, most likely it would be deemed as hardcore pornography, as opposed to if there was a sex scene between two men or two women in our present day, it wouldn't necessarily be seen as hardcore pornography. So it's the reason why I brought up these two cases is because I think it's really interesting. When we think of definitions, we think that they're set in stone. We think that they are already defined and they don't change. It's the one argument that we have that doesn't change through history. But as we can see, the definitions that we have are incredibly fluid. And we start to see, especially in the case of hardcore pornography or obscenity laws, that the cultural context or the cultural climate has a really big say in creating these definitions. And so this brings us to our conversation today about definitions. And I know that this took a long time to get to, but I think it's really important for us to really contextualize the importance of definition, especially now in American society, that definitions matter. That arguments of definitions aren't these abstract exercises. These actually have a lot of stakes in determining who people are and who is excluded. And so there are contentious and often have important consequences for ordinary people, whether that is in regards to women's reproductive rights, whether it's in regards to immigration reform, whether it's in regards to marriage and the LGBT rights. We start to see that these issues in regards to definition begin to play more of a role in our society. And so they wield the power to say what someone or something is or can be. Has there been a major case in the last 20 years in which we shifted our definition of something or someone to include? Madeline.
Same-sex marriage was legalized in 2013, summer 2013. That was
Yeah, so our definition of marriage has completely changed.
Mhm.
Are there any other instances where we have seen a definition completely change? Andrea.
I think the Civil Rights Act falls into that too.
What do you mean?
Well, before that, I mean, why else would people march for rights that were supposedly protected by the Constitution, but why did they still have to fight for it? So I think it's a matter of what they defined as equality back then as to how they defined it afterwards.
Yeah, so in regards to kind of voting rights, who was allowed to be a valid voter or not, in regards to specific polling information, we start to see that the identities of individuals begin to become shifted. Stephen.
So this was actually on the most recent ballot. Was one of the things was bringing back, I believe the common term to refer to it is as affirmative action was what I'd heard, basically saying that there is to some extent allowing discrimination based upon sex and race, intended to be you benefit those, Proposition 16, benefit those who have historically been harmed due to that. But then that also, I think that also to some extent does redefine things. If you say that the Civil Rights Act redefines it, you kind of inherently have to say that that would redefine equality as well, because you're doing these things, I guess, in pursuit of equality.
Yeah. And so, we use the word equality. And so in some cases, there might have to be exclusion in order for equality to be met. Andrea.
I have a question. So for example, in China, the law that prohibited more than one child per family and then later on being overturned, is that one example?
Yeah, that could be another example. Yeah. But not of a definition, but of a law. And so, does that make sense? And so, yeah. And so when we talk about these definitions, political, social, and scientific terms are re-argued, reshaped, and updated constantly. So terms such as intelligence or even social justice, or war, or marriage, have been completely shifted. The ways in which we now engage in war is completely different than how we engaged in war, let's say 200 and 300 years ago. Even 50 years ago, we are now starting to see more cyber war space, a war and warcraft occurring now. And so that brings us to this really cool moment in history in which we now see the power of definitions. And so because of that, we realize that there are three key definitional types that we utilize in our everyday lives or whenever we are trying to create arguments. So there are three key types. Now, the first type is one that you've probably seen before. It's the one that we traditionally use. It's the one that we often consider to be set in stone, and those are the formal definitions. And so these are the dictionary definitions which place things in their proper term, genus, and species. And so we first determine it by class. So for those that have ever taken a science class before, it's the very similar thing that we do, but for these particular definitions. Now, these definitions are a little bit more set in stone. They're more legal in nature. We utilize these definitions, especially when we are talking about cases such as legality. So things such as citizenship is one thing that we, that the definition of, or the formal definition of, is something that we really try to get a clear definition of. Another one that has been going around is domestic terrorism. For a long time in American society, this term of domestic terrorism didn't actually exist. There was terrorism, and within the last 20 years, we started to see this term domestic terrorism. What is domestic terrorist? What is a domestic terrorist? When I say that term, what is it? Madeline?
The first thing that comes to mind is somebody, I'm sorry, I don't have the right definition, I don't think, but somebody around you of your home country or whatever, infringing on whatever rights that you've grown up with.
Yeah. So the Patriot Act was the very first time in which we were able to actually define domestic terrorism, and it occurred in 2001. And so it involves acts dangerous to human life that are violations of the criminal laws of the United States or any state, and they appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population. Now, what's really interesting about this definition is that we've had domestic terrorism ever since America was created. But it's also interesting that a lot of groups that would have been seen as domestic terrorists are finally being put into that particular realm. And we even start to see groups such as Antifa now being placed into the realm of domestic terrorists. The Black Panther Party, the new Black Panther Party is now domestic terrorists. The KKK is a domestic terrorist, but that actually didn't occur until 10 years ago. And so we start to see how even within these formal definitions, how we apply those definitions can also shift. And so many arguments involve deciding whether an object meets the criteria set by a formal definition. But there are some cases where the formal definition just doesn't work. And we have to experience that particular issue. And it's through that experience or the context that we can define something. Now, that sounds really abstract, but once we start to talk about the examples, I think we'll make it clear. So an operational definition is the second type of definition. And that's where we identify an object or an idea by what it does or by what conditions it creates. So these are incredibly interesting because it's not a formal definition. We can only see this issue whenever we see what it by its causes or its effects. And so the conditions define what makes an act that might be acceptable in some situations. So we're unable to define what something is until we're able to put it into its proper context. And so arguments arise from operational definitions whenever people disagree about what the conditions define or whether these conditions have been fulfilled. So let's say in the case of stalking, what is stalking?
An invasion of privacy.
An invasion of privacy. What do you mean by invasion of privacy?
I guess it's an invasion, but is also a vigilant way of, or just a very aggressive way of vigilating or like observing someone.
What do you mean by aggressive?
Imposing that authority over someone without them like having a say in it or not.
Unsolicited.
Madeline, then
Yeah,
Amani.
that.
That's all I wanted to say. It's just she was just going to say unsolicited.
All right, Amani.
I think stalking is kind of like, well, it depends on how far you go with like stalking, but kind of like a crazy way of trying to get to know somebody. Or like, yeah.
So is it possible? So is constantly looking at a person's social media sites stalking?
It can be.
I would say in a sense it can be. It depends on the level of stalking that one is doing. I think in the conventional sense, it's again unsolicited
So
observation.
what's that level?
By definition, yes, it is.
It's unsolicited observation, but I think there's a degree of stalking. If you're not harming the person, then I don't think it's, the same thing as unsolicited, at times violent and creepy observation. Maybe it's a little creepy. I don't know. But I know that I stalk people constantly on social media just because, one, I haven't seen them in a while or I want to know what they're up to. And I can't send them a text because I don't know, I get nervous. And I don't know, maybe that's
I like Ashley's definition. She says follow, harass, or bother.
Yeah. Ashley, then Stephen.
Unmute. Okay. I think it gets to a level of stalking, because especially with social media, because if a person's page is open and not private, then everybody has a right to come and look at it because it's social media and that's what you're on there for. But I think it gets to a level if it's unwanted attention. So some people want the attention, but if it gets to be unwanted and then you keep on and the person blocks, like if I block somebody and then they go to extent of making a fake page or using somebody else's page, that's when it becomes stalking. Because to just look at somebody's page that's open, or if we're friends and I friended you and you come and look at my page, it's not stalking. You're just following and doing whatever social media platform is for. You're supposed to be looking at their page to keep up with them, but it becomes stalking and under the realm and definition of stalking when it's unwanted attention and bothersome and aggressive and on a level of like a threat to that person's well-being and their peaceful environment.
All right, and Stephen.
So I think something important to note is I think that there may be, I guess, stalking isn't necessarily black and white so much as there's kind of a gray zone, and you can be stalking someone, but it's usually only problematic at which the point when it becomes harassment, or you begin upsetting someone by doing it, like Madeline had mentioned, following someone on social media. You could very well call that stalking under some definitions, but it's also not necessarily a problem because it's not bothersome to anybody. It doesn't harm anybody. It's not harassing anybody. Nobody feels the need to. It does not inhibit anybody's freedoms because they don't even necessarily know that you're doing it. But there are also types of stalking where you very much are beginning to become a threat to someone's freedom. You're harassing them. And so I guess depending on who it is, they define that differently.
So my childhood friend, his father would tell us a story about of how he asked my friend's mom out on a date like 5 different times throughout the years, and she always said no. And he just kept asking her over and over again until she finally was worn down and she said yes. And then eventually they went on a date and they had a wonderful marriage, etc. Is that an instance of stalking? She said no 5 times. Ashley, then Amani.
I don't think that was stalking. I think that might have just been him being persistent.
What's the difference between persistence and stalking?
Because I think stalking I think it's a different, if he was aggressive and
5 times is aggressive.
It's not aggressive. I think that's persistent. Like if she felt like she was in like a danger or a threat, like if he was in a threatening manner and like being more creepy, like I don't know. I think it's a difference. Like somebody being persistent, like, man, I really think you look nice. Let me take you out. That's persistent. Like you just, he sees
What
something.
if you don't like them?
If you don't like them, then yeah, I think that's when it can get, creepy-ish. I think it just all like I think was that Steven who just said it's a gray area. It is no black and white to it because of it's emotional.
But we're trying to set up the black and white. We're trying to set up the criteria of
but I don't think because it deals with emotions, right? Like it might have been a point in time where I was married to somebody and we divorced. So there was feelings and emotions there. With stuff like that, you can't do a black and white because that person might still have an emotional connection. You don't. So it's that gray area and you don't, you can't, it's no black and white when it's feelings involved and a hot and coldness. It's always going to be a gray area.
All right, we got to finish this up. So Amani, then Madeline, this became way more interesting as it continued.
I think it's a form of harassment because he kept on asking her and she was like, no. I feel like it kind of relates to like sex. Like if a guy keeps on asking a woman for sex and during the 5th time she says yes, that's kind of like harassment. You're like harassing her for sex, which is kind of like rape, I would assume.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right. And so this issue of harassment is really interesting, but it also bleeds into issues such as consent. So California has one of probably the more strictest rules or laws in regards to consent. So the formal definition is an enthusiastic yes. But then we start to realize that's not actually a formal definition, because what does an enthusiastic yes mean? Does that just mean like yes? Like, is there an opportunity to have an enthusiastic nonverbal yes? Does it always have to be enthusiastic? Andrea?
I think with that question, I think this is one of those times where actions or like a picture like says more than 1,000 words kind of thing. Like it depends on the circumstances, I guess. Like each case is very specific and detailed, so it would depend.
Well, what are the circumstances? Like this is an actual law. Like should the law be determined by circumstances?
Good question.
Amani, Madeline, then Stephen.
Oh, sorry, my hand. I took it down.
Okay, Madeline.
Law not based on circumstances? Meaning, do we not have a circumstance for first-degree murder? Do we not have a circumstance for rape? Do we not have a circumstance for tax fraud?
Well, we do, but in terms of consent, though, like enthusiastic consent, that seems like that's a lot. It's very subjective term.
I don't think consent is subjective, and I think enthusiasm means that
enthusiasm is subjective.
Somebody's willing to participate, and if there is a clear and concrete yes or no when you are about to perform a sexual act with someone, then that breeds consent. It doesn't necessarily.
Okay, but what if you can't speak? Like, what if you physically are deaf, or like, how do you?
So enthusiasm then in your language, whatever that means, if you're going
like
to
pulling
say
back
yes in ASL or whatever, then you would do so. But if you pull back or start to run away from someone, or you're pushing them away,
that's
or
explicitly saying no. Yeah,
that's physically violently saying no. And I think that kind of circumstance is obvious. And if anyone tries to argue that, that's when the subjectivity in the circumstance becomes gray, and it can become bad very quickly for those involved.
And finishing it up, Ashley.
I feel like sometimes you can be in a situation where you say yes, but you really don't mean yes. It's just because of the situation that you're in. So us as women sometimes can get put in a sticky situation, like and not on purpose. Just like you may go on a date and the guy pays whatever, you're going home and you say yes to I'm gonna just say sex, like maybe like in the car, because the guy's all over you, you start to feel threatened and you don't want to get, let's say, beat up or whatever, because now you heard this guy's getting real aggressive and you say yes to sex because you don't want to get raped. You don't want the forceful part. You don't want the whatever. So it's a lot of times that people are in positions where they say yes to avoid the negative or psychoticness and maybe their life being threatened with a no.
Well, that's kind of what, isn't that what the law is trying to avoid, or trying to rectify that?
Right, but then it turns around that, oh, it was consensual. You get what I'm saying? Because we've said the yes.
Okay, and so that includes kind of like the enthusiasm behind it. So it doesn't necessarily factor in the fear factor. And so like what it's trying to rectify, it actually doesn't. It actually could lead to worse cases because of that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
That's a really interesting point. Thank you for sharing that, Ashley. All right, so thank you guys for sharing that. I thought that was a really interesting discussion, but we start to see though, how difficult it becomes to set up criteria because the criteria is ever shifting. And so with an operational definition, that criteria is key, that if it's true in one case, it has to be true in several other cases. So like the criteria definitely has to match. But then we start to get into an even trickier situation with definitions by example. So in some cases, we don't actually are able to define what something is. We're only able to define it by what it is or what it's not in regards to other objects or issues that are similar to it. So a definition by example is whenever we define a class by listing its individual members. So in this case, it's easier to illustrate or show what related people or things have in common than to explain each one in precise detail. So if you've ever been at a loss for a word and you were like, it's like that other word, it's like this other thing. What you're doing is trying to like come up with a definition by example or trying to find a term by example. An instance of this can be seen of what is an Android phone? What is an Android phone?
The phone that's not an iPhone.
It's a phone that's not an iPhone, yes. And so in that particular case, it was a definition by an example. It's like, it's a phone, but it's not an iPhone. And so you were able to define it by that particular term. Are there other things that we try to define by listing things that are similar to it? So instead of like defining it, we try to list things that are very similar to that particular case. I think one of the key ones is issues of racism. We are able to define racism by how similar it is to other cases of racism. So if someone were to wear blackface, is that racism? If a Black person wears blackface, is that racism?
I would say, well, I don't even know if I have the authority to say yes or no. Honestly.
Yes, yes, and yes.
Thank you.
She came through as
You are very welcome, Madeline.
Why? As the authority, why in that case?
Yeah, Ashley, go ahead.
So in the early 20th century, African-American artists weren't allowed to actually perform on stage unless they were in blackface. And so are they racist because that was the only way in which they could perform?
I feel like in that situation, that was the only way they could perform, but I feel like it was forced upon them. So they had to do what they were in a situation to do. But now in this current time where people have a choice to do things differently, if you were to do it right now and you made that choice to do it, you were making a mockery of your people who had to suffer through things like that. Okay. And that is racist.
Okay. And thank you for that one. But also in addition to race, we also start to see that we utilize it in terms of political ideology. So if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you are normally able to define by what you are, not necessarily through a strict definition of conservative or liberalism. Most likely you utilize examples of issues that align with your particular party or your particular political ideology. So instead of going by definitions, you list examples of things that your party or your ideology represent. And so we're able to see that we utilize those definitions. And so these arguments often involve comparisons and contrasts with the items that most readers or listeners would agree belong to that particular list. Now, finally, this is the last slide. So whenever we are trying to formulate our claims, we begin by formulating a tentative claim. We realize that these statements aren't arguments until we have attached reasons, data, and warrants. So remember, an argument is not an argument until you attach that data, until you attach those warrants to it. But what's key here is that to be persuasive, the definition must be broad and not tailored to a specific situation. And so I think this is key, and this is also where these types of arguments fall apart. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of our arguments are in the present day, that we're trying to win arguments and we weaponize definitions to win arguments. So if I were to say, when does life begin? When does life begin? When does human life begin? Madeline.
Well, I think human life I think human life begins when you hear a heartbeat, when you see cells.
And so I see a hesitancy in saying that.
Because
and so do you realize that the definition you're trying to use is one that is also based upon the argument you're trying to make? So is it really a definition if that definition is shifting depending upon your argument?
I don't think it would be a definition then. I think I'd be trying to make an argument in defining something. And
yeah. Andrea, then Steven.
Yeah.
Can't hear you, Andrea.
You can't hear me?
No, now I can.
Okay. What if the baby is stillborn, or what if it's born like at the moment of like if it's in the womb and everything's fine, it's alive inside, but once it's born, what we call born, like exiting the human body, and it's not able to live on its own, then is he technically alive? No, I don't think so. I think you're first born when you scream, or like when you exit, like when you're actually born into this world. I don't think life begins at conception, to be honest.
Steven.
Well, this isn't on the point of abortion. I think another possible example of this could be affirmative action, as if you define racism as discrimination by someone's sex or race, and affirmative action is inherently saying we're going to do something for someone because of their sex or race, is that not inherently discriminating against everyone else? So that becomes a question of, is that in and of itself something that's racist? So I think that's another good example of like the definition itself kind of starts to fall apart when you look at that. But then people will also argue that people argue both sides of it, I guess.
Yeah. And so we start to see how complicated definitions really are. And that's kind of one of the big lessons I wanted to have with this discussion. I think that we throw around terms like conservatives, liberals, we are right to life and this and that. And we throw these terms around and we try to define them, but our definitions behind them are really haphazard. And we start to see that there's a reason why these issues still remain. It's because we haven't actually come to a consensus with the definitions, because we haven't actually sat down and actually made a definition. Now, depending upon which definition you want to use, it's going to depend upon the argument. But we start to see how we can utilize different forms of definitions to make different cases. But we also realize that there are limitations for all of these types of definitions. And you have to keep that into consideration when you're making these arguments, but also making sure that you establish your criteria for the audience to let them know that it's not just in this case, but it's also in multiple cases that this definition can apply. All right, Andrea.
By limitations, do you mean like when you're doing the Rogerian argument, or like when you're trying to?
Yeah. So like there's limitations. So like in the case of affirmative action and discrimination, like if we were to use an operational argument, it's like, well, this is, technically we're trying to undo discrimination. And then someone could say, well, isn't this discrimination? And so we start to see, well, then what is our criteria for discrimination? What is our criteria for racism? And we start to see that we need to establish that criteria before we're able to even use that word discrimination.
But like a bipartisan criteria?
Not a bipartisan criteria, but a criteria that you can use in multiple situations. That
Okay.
This table will always be a table, no matter if I'm here or if there is a bird here or if anyone else is here. Someone can always walk in and see that this is a table and will be able to define it. Does that make sense? This
Yeah,
table
a lot.
doesn't magically become a slide as soon as I leave the room. All right, good. Depending upon how you use it. But that is it for today's lecture. But right now, we are going to transition into the exciting part of today, which is our determination of groups. So I was only able to get one group. I had Andrea, Madeline, and Jordan. I know there was another group that messaged me on last Monday. Which group was that? I know it was a group that had Johnny Con in it. Do you guys remember?
It was me, Nina, and Johnny Con. Ashley, Nina, and Johnny Con.
Ashley, Nina, and Johnny Con. Cool. All right. And did anyone else have a group? These are the only groups that I actually have. All right.
Yeah, Amani and I would like to be in a group, and we can take anyone else who doesn't.
Okay, so say that again. So who and Amani? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Michaela and Amani.
Michaela and Amani. All right, give me a second. All right, 1 second.
Sometime later.
All right. And then, sorry, I'm just trying to get everything set up for you guys, and then I'm going to announce the groups in literally 10 seconds. And Nicole, do you have a group?
I don't.
All right, cool. Then I think I have it. All right. All right, give me 1 second. I think I have everyone that I need. All right, so we have Andrea, Madeline, and Jordan C, Ashley, Nina, and Johnny Con, Charlene, Stephen, and Morgan, Alma, Nia, and Nicole, Amani, Michaela, and Jordan, Jay, Ferris, and Connor. So those will be the teams. I will be posting up this tonight, but once again, Andrea, Madeline, and Jordan C, Ashley, Nina, and Johnny Con, Charlene, Stephen, and Morgan, Alma, Nia, and Nicole, and Amani and Michaela versus Jordan, Jay, Ferris, and Connor. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so that means I am now going to release who you will be debating. So just give me 1 second. All right, so Andrea, Madeline, and Jordan C, you'll be debating Ashley, Nina, and Johnny Con. Charlene, Stephen, and Morgan will be debating Alma, Nia, and Nicole. Amani and Michaela will be debating Jordan, Jay, Ferris, and Connor. Those will be the debates for this year. All right, so
You said so fast. Can you say that again, or are you gonna post it?
I'm gonna post it too.
Oh, okay.
And I'm about to show it on the screen in a second. All right, so Andrea, Madeline, and Jordan C, since you guys were the very first group to email me, I want you to pick a number between 1 and 8.
1 and 8.
1 and
Madeline,
8.
any number?
Any number between 1 and 8.
Hold on, let's mind meld. 4.
We're gonna make it quick. Okay, I have a number.
Go for it.
4.
4. All right, so your topic. So the debate between Andrea, Madeline, and Jordan C versus Ashley, Nina, and Johnny Con. The United States should cede the territory of Puerto Rico.
Yes, I wanted that one.
All right, so
Okay.
Ashley, pick between heads or tails.
Heads always.
It is tails. Andrea, Madeline, Jordan C, which position do you want to be, after an egg?
Madeline, you go now. I chose the number.
Affirmative.
Affirmative. All right, you got it. All right,
Okay.
Stephen, since you are the only person here, and no, all right, and Nicole, sorry. Stephen, I'm gonna let you pick between a number between 1 and 8 that is not number 4.
3.
3. Oh, you're gonna love this one. The United States federal government should legalize prostitution. So once again, that debate between Charlene, Stephen, and Morgan versus Alma, Nia, and Nicole. The United States federal government should legalize prostitution. Nicole, pick between heads and tails.
Tails.
It is heads again. Stephen, do you want to be aff or neg?
I think I'll go for affirmative.
All right. All right. And our final debate between Amani, Michaela versus Jordan J, Ferris, and Connor, since those, so I'm going to have Michaela pick a number between 1 and 8 that is not 3 or 4.
I'll do 6.
All right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, you're gonna like this one right here. The United States should abolish the imperial system of measurement.
Oh, interesting.
All right. And Jordan J, are you there?
Yeah.
All right. Heads or tails?
Heads.
All right. And it is, you said tails, right?
I said heads.
Okay, well, it's heads. So you want aff or neg?
Negs.
All right, you will have the negative position for that debate. All right, so I'm about to post this right now in the chat for everyone to see. I will also post this later tonight on the course Canvas page in the next hour or so. So there will be an opportunity in your, I'm gonna post up a page where you and your group can coordinate and correspond to each other. So you can use that for collaboration. All right, so there is no class on Wednesday, but I will be posting up sample debates and sample lectures of chapter 10 and also for your debates later tonight and tomorrow morning. Are there any questions before we leave today? No. All right. That is it. I'm really excited for you guys to begin your research. These are some really fun topics this semester. So I'm really excited to see what you guys are able to do with them. So begin talking to your group mates now. The research usually takes about a week to complete. So don't wait until 2 days before your debate before you get started. And also please contact me if there are group members that are not communicating. That is the worst thing about doing these group projects, especially over Zoom. So make sure to communicate with me. If someone is not communicating, I'll make sure to get on them ASAP. Everyone that I've listed are people that are still in this class that have done a really good job. So there should be no one that is, negligent in terms of their time. All right, everyone. Thank you all so very much. And I'll see you all next Monday.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.